and for St. Mark's Hospital Radio recently under the name of Crystal Peak. So here we go.
Thank you. Tough act to follow up. I wasn't expecting that to follow that. My talk is basically on the benefits and limits of rational thinking. So I'll start just by pointing out the limits of our senses. We start with our eyes. We all know that there's things around us that we can't see. Atoms, bacteria, viruses. There's gases in the air. We don't see them, but we know they're there. So that our senses are limited. Same with our hearing. There's sound waves, sound frequencies we don't hear. So much so, a guy once invented an alarm put in areas where teenagers loiter to emit a sound that would annoy the teenagers, but the adults would not hear because our hearing isn't as good as teenagers. Also, our sense of smell. Anyone who hands out with a dog will know the dogs pick up on scents that we do not pick up on. On top of that, so moving on from that, our brains are also limited in how they process information. We have rational brains. So our brains add meaning and reason to things, add meaning and reason to life. Our brains also compose stories to help us digest the constant random events that are occurring all around us. Mark Twain said that truth is stranger than fiction because fiction has to stick within the realms of possibility. The truth does not. So for us to buy into fiction, it has to make sense. So fiction has to make sense. And then we use fiction to inform us about life, but life does not make sense. Damien Hirst has an art piece where it's two glass cubes, and in one there's a live fly's nest, and in the other there's a fly zapper, a cow's severed head and a pool of blood. And he said when he first made it, he used to watch it for hours, and he'd watch the flies fly in, and some of them would fly straight to the zapper and die. Some would fly all around the cube and then into the zapper and die. And some would fly for ages, in and out of the two cubes. Eventually everyone flies and dies to the fly zapper. But he watched it and he wondered what was the reason some fly straight away and others take time and others take longer and still. And he came to the conclusion that there was no reason. That there was no reason why some flies died straight away and others last a bit longer. When we look at this then from a human perspective, a couple of weeks ago on Who Do You Think You Are, Brian Blessed, the actor, was on it. And the most interesting part of his family history was his great-granddad's family were bookbinders in London, just off the Strand. And then at the time they moved to Portsmouth, because Portsmouth was a boom town because England was at war with France. So there was a lot of business on it. They went down to Portsmouth and they invested their future heavily financially in Portsmouth. But the war ended and the economy of Portsmouth tanked. So within a couple of years, the parents of the family were dead. And there was two sons left, an 8-year-old and a 6-year-old. And they were sent to a workhouse in London where they were separated by their age. The records then show that Gemini, who was 8, he escaped the workhouse. And then there's records of how he worked at various jobs and made a living. And then there's a record of him in the 50s in Yorkshire where he's reunited with his brother who's in the workhouse. So when we hear these kind of stories, particularly if they're our own family, we invest a lot of reason and meaning in this. What was the reason this would happen? What was the meaning this happened? But if we look at this story from a scientific and numerical point of view, we'll realise that it was just pure luck. If you analysed all the data the brothers that went into the workhouses, the odds of them surviving the conditions, most people died from disease, for two brothers to escape and then survive on their wits, and not only to survive on their wits, then to beat up again with primitive communication at the time, like the odds are completely stacked against them. So rational thinking is incredibly beneficial when you're in a situation where the odds are stacked against you, because you don't want to be thinking about the odds. If you're in a situation where the odds are stacked against you, you want to be telling yourself stories of why you're special, why you're going to survive, all the reasons, all the meanings you're going to survive. In Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, about his time in Auschwitz where he observed the other prisoners, he noted that most people died in the month of January. And he said, what was the reason for this? The reason for this was a lot of people were telling themselves the story that the war would be over by Christmas. When Christmas came and the war wasn't over, people gave up. Because that was the story they were clinging to. And when it was no longer a believable story, they weren't able to go on. Successful people and great survivors are incredibly good at writing these stories. They're great at rational thinking. Their stories can encompass anything. Their stories help them ignore the odds and fight on. In Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, he talks about the success fallacy. He says if you talk to successful people, they talk about their life and their path to success with a sense of inevitability. It was always going to happen. It was written in the stars, it was destiny, no matter what I would have made it, you know. And then when you look back in their life and you look at it in detail, you'll see that the biggest factor that got them where they were was luck. All across the lawn, there was flicks of the coin where they just made it and it could have gone the other way. But they're big believers in their own stories. If you go in any bookshop, you'll see big thick books by successful people, my story, my journey and all this. So rational thinking, brilliant for individual survival. The limits of rational thinking though are when people are making decisions for other people. You'd like to think that your leaders use evidence, data and possible and probable outcomes to make decisions, implement government policy that affects us all, but they don't. They make the decisions on their rational thoughts because they're such big believers in their own story and their rational thoughts. They constantly reject scientific evidence, expert opinion and make decisions on this. This is not beneficial for us. I'll give you an example of this. So Angela Merkel is a strong, popular, rational leader. She's the daughter of a religious pastor. When the financial crisis hit and Greece was struggling, this is what the experts said. They said, Greece needs money. You have the money. For Germany's economic future, it needs to be part of an economic team to compete with the BRIC countries. For that economic team to be successful and Germany's economic future to be successful, you need all of those economies performing and functioning. So you need to give them money. Germany accepted these facts and were happy to give them money. Germany's problem then became they didn't like how the Greeks did business. The Greeks are disorganised, they're flash with cash, and they're irresponsible with money. The German economic narrative goes like this: if you work hard, if you're responsible, if you're responsible with your money, if you're prudent, you will be successful. If you're irresponsible, reckless, and flash with cash, you will fail. So they couldn't back a failing story. So they said they'd give the money, but they wanted changes. The experts said that would be too slow. Give the money now and then try and implement the changes. They said if they did that, the Greeks wouldn't agree to the changes afterwards. The experts said you're probably right, but what case have you done it? Paul Krugman, a Nobel Prize economist, said this was the modern day equivalent of sacrificing people to appease the gods. The Germans sacrificed the Greek economy, even though they knew it would be detrimental to their own economy in the future, to protect a story, an economic narrative of prudence, responsibility, and to make people see that reckless behaviour and being flash with your cash will lead to failure, not to success. So how do you change this? The only way to change this is further scientific education, so people become more accepting about scientific-based evidence within government policy, and also people realise that the stories they live by, the stories that rule them, are just that. They are just stories. So that when they encounter other people whose stories contradict their stories, they don't feel the need to attack or destroy them. I'll give you one example of how powerful and potent evidence-based policy can be. The last time this country passed a drug policy law based on evidence was in the 1980s, and it was Margaret Thatcher who did it. There was a heroin problem in many cities in England, and the medical community said there was going to be a HIV problem. And she said, what do we do to solve it? And they said, give them clean needles. And at the time, that doesn't fit into any narrative. That's not part of being British, that's not part of being Tory, that's not part of being moral. How do you justify that? How do you sell that? How do you make that into your story? You can't. The general public were all against it when they told. The newspaper salvaged it. She did it anyway. It prevented HIV, and the policy was copied all around the world. So that's my speech.
That's it, guys. Thanks for coming. Much information you can fit into 6 minutes. Fascinating. So hopefully all of you people are going to be texting me and tweeting me and saying you want to speak at the next one, which is in about a month or 6 weeks' time. We found out this morning we have funding, so maybe we have a few free drinks at the next one. And you can find me on Twitter at NerdNation Tigerston, and I'll get back to you. Thanks very much.